Okay. So I think it's time to start this morning plenary session, the last plenary of this fabulous conference. And after the plenary, please don't leave immediately because there will be a very short presentation of next CDC. And now coming back to our plenary event, as you might have heard yesterday in the award ceremony, so the Bode Prize is our top Control Systems Society award, and is recognizing fantastic leaders that had an enormous impact on our research and on our community as a whole. And certainly David Hill is one of those outstanding leaders, and I'm just now spending a few words about his contributions and his bio. So David is a Professor Emeritus in the School of Electrical and Information Engineering, the University of Sydney, Australia. And in 2022, actually I just learned in November 2022, he became Professor of Power and Energy Systems at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And during 2013-2020, he held the Chair of Electrical Engineering at the University of Hong Kong. And he has also held several academic and substantial visiting positions at the University of Melbourne, UC Berkeley, Newcastle in Australia, Lund in Sweden, Munich, City University of Hong Kong, and so on. There are many. And his contributions in research are extremely broad in power and energy systems, control system, networks, learning systems, stability analysis, and many others. He is a fellow of SIAM, IFAC, the Australian Academy of Science, the Australian Academy of Technological Science and Engineering, and the Hong Kong Academy of Engineering Science. He is also a foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences, and he received the 2021 IEEE Power and Energy Society Prabha Kundo Power System Dynamics and Control Award. And I think we can speak another half an hour about the many achievements you had, but since we are very excited to hear about power system dynamics and control, your vision and your ideas about that, I stop here and I welcome David to give this fantastic lecture.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to see you here. Thank you, Thomas, for that kind introduction. Okay, the topic, and well, let me say, of course, as I've said, it's a great honor to have this lecture, especially when you see the people who've gone before. Some, of course, are in the room. So let's hope my topic lives up to that. The topic is power systems, and I have several aims. One is to convince you that power systems is a serious subject with theory, all the way from theory to practice, with deep and meaningful questions in the past and especially now. It's a subject which is intimately connected to control. The power grid only works because over the 100 years of development of the grid, control theory has played a major part. I will illustrate this with some of my own activities, but not to dwell on that for too long, because I want to make a call to arms that we need control theory again. And I'll refer to the Australian situation where the future has arrived. The electrification of the power grid using renewable power is seen as a major contribution to climate change mitigation, and we are faced with a whole lot of new dynamics and control problems. So if I get some young people here excited about those problems, then that would be another great outcome. So the talk will proceed with some motivation, and then I will briefly give a take on how power and control relate to each other, and then a bit of my own experience where the issues of structure versus data and with learning has come up over and over again. And as time permits, I'll get on to what are the good problems now facing us with future grids, and then make some conclusions. The point in this slide is simply to say that over 100 years since, you may have seen the movie about current wars, since Edison, Tesla and Westinghouse sort of fought it out over what kind of grid we'll have, there's been a succession of transitions. And each of these transitions has had a central dynamics and stability problem. The early days, in the early last century, the issue was establishing a large synchronous system that wouldn't have transient stability problems. And there were major names I'm mentioning here, Russia and the US. In Russia, of course, there's the famous Lenin quote that communism equals electrification plus Soviets. So they enlisted many of their major scientists, those that weren't in jail anyway, and to help develop their grid. But a similar story went on throughout Europe and the US. Later on, they wanted to expand the grid to a nationwide system, and there were lots of oscillation problems and frequency control problems, and a famous name there is Nathan Cohn, who I'll come back to later. Then in the 70s, people didn't like power stations in their backyard. They were made more remote, and there was a series of voltage collapses in many countries. And along with that came an energy crisis, and I'm going to mention this program in the US called Systems Engineering for Power. Later came the electricity markets, and in a sense then dynamics and control problems kind of got forgotten about for a while, but there was some revival over 10 years ago when people started talking about smart grids. But right now, at least in Australia and many countries, we are going through the largest transition. Of all the transitions I've just mentioned, we are probably going through the largest one ever. And I'll just connect this back to last year's Bodhi lecture by Pramod Kokonikar, where he emphasised how control can have an influence on emissions and climate change. Today, I'll try and follow that up. It's the electrification of the grid using renewables which will mitigate climate change, not only in the electricity industry, but in the transport industry, manufacturing industry. So this can make a huge contribution to mitigating climate change. In Australia, we talk about two transitions, and these diagrams are a little bit complicated, but let me distill something out of them. The left one was meant to show the orderly retirement of coal-fired power plants over a window out to about 2050. The horizontal arrows show that this is happening way faster than was anticipated, simply because these coal-fired plants are going out of business and they're not viable anymore. And in an attempt to replace them, there's a whole lot of wind farms and solar farms coming along, but that's all happening at a very fast pace without the usual, you might say, checks and balances that applied in the past. The right-hand diagram shows what the energy mix will look like out over a similar period. And if we go in the centre here somewhere, around about 2030, you can see that coal-fired fossil fuel plants, which are the black ones, are pretty much already out the door. And the mix is rooftop solar, a very major component, and then solar farms, and then we've got big batteries and other forms of energy storage. This is a totally different system to the one, what we might call the classical system, and raises many dynamics and control issues. Now, I'd like to tell a little story about how did we get from the classical grid in Australia, coal-fired, to this situation where within a decade it's pretty close to 100%, possibly 100%. And it's interesting how these things happen. There were many moving parts in this story. The government was a bit reluctant. But in the meantime, people were putting rooftop solar on their roof at a great rate, and things were moving towards renewables. But there was a tipping point when we had a major blackout in 2016, and Elon Musk said, and there was a lot of blame game going on about who was responsible. Some people tried to blame the renewables. Anyway, Elon came up in the middle of all this and said, well, if I can give you a big battery that'll fix all your problems. And this young entrepreneur, Cannon Brooks, he's a major software entrepreneur in Australia, made a bet with him that, well, can you do it in 100 days? And Elon Musk says, yep, 100 days or free. And anyway, the wheels turned, and we ended up with the world's biggest battery by a factor of about 3 or 4. And it was still kind of, not seen as a sensible thing until they saw the impact of this big battery in the grid. It immediately started working for frequency control, for various network services. And so then after that, it's almost every week we hear about the biggest battery or the biggest solar farm in Australia. So that's my take. You need a tipping point. It's interesting, you need a tipping point, and now Australia's it's no turning back. It may be a rough ride, but we're headed to 100%. Okay, power and control. Well, I think this marketing slogan from Pirelli Tyres says it all. Power is nothing without control. And these are the subjects that some of you anyway, have already embraced. We need to plan power systems. That's a mixed integer, multi-period, multi-objective optimization, and we already have papers going on in that area for the new era. We need to balance energy, power and ramping, and once again, that's some version of a big optimization problem. Lots of constrained OP, what we call optimal power flow, and there's a fair bit of activity there. But where I think there's less activity right now in the power community is on the stabilising, what are the new stability problems, how can we deal with them, the control and the recovery. So I'd like to say more about that as I go on. The power system is talked about as a very complex, possibly the most complex system made by people, and it has everything for the control community. It has nonlinearity, a large network structure, and it's granular, and even more granular these days. I talk about, it used to be transmission, sub-transmission, distribution, but now it's a big granular system where devices in your household can contribute to services on the big grid. So it's kilowatts to gigawatts, and that makes the network wide area and granular, which I think brings new issues. It's also much less predictable, a lot more uncertainty, and in fact I like to think of the power grid now as embedded in the weather system from end to end. And there's a kind of an interesting feedback loop that the old power grid influenced the weather, but now the weather's influencing the power grid and how to make all that work. And it's mixed, discrete and continuous. So from a theoretical point of view, it has pretty well everything that you might want. Okay, to anchor the discussion of complexity, I just remind you of the famous power flow equations. These arise by turning the linear nodal circuit equations into equations between powers and voltages, and then you get this highly nonlinear system. And a lot of mathematics has been thrown at this system. And I mentioned in particular John Bailey down the front here. I'm pretty sure I saw some papers by him years ago where, was it algebraic geometry and various mathematics were thrown at the solution structure of these equations. And there's a lot of numerical analysis. But these complicated nonlinear equations just establish an operating point. The dynamics around that operating point can be really complicated and often not talked about. We think for the classical grid in terms of angles, frequency, and voltages. Angles, the whole system runs, it's an electromechanical system, it runs at a reference frequency, either electrical, 60, 50 hertz, or a rotation of the rotational inertia in the synchronous machines. And it's the angles relative to that which have to be kept, in either mechanical terms or electrical terms, have to be kept small to keep synchronism. It's a big synchronous system. But also the frequency is very important as an indicator of power balance. And so we have a control problem, which I'll mention a little bit more later. But also the frequency is subject to oscillations. And there's been, people have studied these oscillations using bifurcations, Hopf bifurcations of different kinds. And then there's the voltage behavior, which is subject to collapses on different time scales. And once again, that gets analysed with some serious mathematics, including bifurcation analysis. So this is theory that's been going on for decades. And I just remind you, I'm not going to go into detail here, that in the classical system, a lot of these problems were overcome from the synchronous generator end. The synchronous generator had two loops, one for frequency control and regulation, and the other for voltage control, which meant that the big generators propped up real power and voltage, and that effectively became pillars of security throughout the grid. These are now disappearing. So that's the first issue. We no longer have these pillars of controllable real power and voltage. Now, this diagram simply represents I mentioned Nathan Cohn, who's an MIT graduate working for Leeds and Northrop, and he had this vision of the power grid operating coast to coast. And he implemented that with classical control. It's proportional integral control, where you have primary frequency control, which was basically the Watt governor, and then what's called automatic generation control, which implemented PI control to bring the frequency error back to zero. And because of this simple scheme, you're able to regulate tie line flows and the frequency of a large system. That gets my vote as one of the most significant applications of control ever, and in terms of impact, so on our daily lives. And now all these issues have been codified in the IEEE Power and Energy Society has lots of task force and working groups, and I was part of one in several years actually before 2004, and all the definitions of power system stability got made more precise in mathematical terms, and there's a lot of debate in these things. So you get this taxonomy of power system stability concepts. Okay, so the establishment of the large wide area grid, the classical grid, depended on classical control. So in that sense, Hendrik Bodde would have been very pleased. But on the way, for special purposes, there's been lots of applications of modern, what you might call modern control. And I just want to give you an impression here. I did a little survey on Power Glove about it, but state estimation, linear state space, nonlinear methods. I remember visiting the Moscow Power Institute many years ago, and undergraduates were learning Lyapunov theory and variable structure control. The system was patched together with all these, with very low reserve margins, but very high use of science. But similar things were done in the US. My colleague Maria Illich at MIT had this application of feedback linearizing controller, and so on. Lyapunov methods, otherwise called transient energy function methods in the power community, have been applied widely and still are. Xiaodong Qiang has a company still applying his techniques, and model predictive control gets used. I just mentioned Stephen Lowe because he told me about his recent commercialization of MPC for electric vehicle charging. ABB has commercial adaptive power system stabilizers due to Om Malik. And Prabhakunda, who was pretty tough on control, people thinking that control theory was the answer to everything, but even he employed H-infinity for a special stabilizer task. So the existing classical grid is held together with control, both classical and with the special purpose applications. Okay, now I'll be a little indulgent of my own activities and just mention some things which got me where I am today, but the takeaway from it is this issue of structure versus data-based methods, which I think is in front of us today in a big way, and you can see in the sessions around us this comes up. Everything I'm going to say for the next few slides is in a survey paper that was actually invited by Naomi Leonard, who may be here today, and I'm pleased to see the announcement last night about her. Okay, so I started at an exciting time in a program called Systems Engineering for Power, which I've learned John Bailey was part of, maybe other people here were too. This was a large program funded by the Department of Energy following the energy crisis in the 70s. And the idea was how to make grids more efficient. And that came back to mathematics and science. So there were many universities involved, MIT, Boston, Illinois, Washington, and many others. And there were many disciplines involved. And the leaders at the Berkeley project, where I was, were Felix Wu, who was a nonlinear circuit theorist, and Praveen Varaya, who seemed to do everything. He was, and very sadly passed away earlier this year in somewhat tragic circumstances. But these, and then I was also influenced a lot by Peter Kokotovich, who seemed to have his feet in both power and control, and I learned a lot from him. The point to make is that this was such an imaginative program, and the students of these theoreticians and postdocs are now some of the major leaders in power systems today. Joe Chow is here, I know. He was a student of Peter. Xiaodong Chiang, Maria Illich, they were all students of theoreticians. And I was a theoretician. I didn't know anything about power much when I joined this program. So what did I work on? Well, it was loosely called Lyapunov's last stand. Lyapunov analysis was being used, but it had a poor theoretical foundation. Actually, there were only rigorous Lyapunov functions for systems of 2 nodes, which was a bit limiting. And also the algorithm accuracy was a bit conservative. So out of all the discussions and opportunities at Berkeley, including reading Pi's book and editing Art Bergen's new text, we got a paper, a structure-preserving model for power system analysis. And that model replaces the classical model where you assumed all the loads had impedances and you did a cron reduction and you just ended up with a network of generators. What we did, the aim was to provide a rigorous Lyapunov function. This was the holy grail there. And, but it turned out, I had been studying interconnected system stability, dissipativity, I had all these tools of stability theory, but they didn't seem to give a good answer. They gave more conservative results. The trick here was simply not to do the cron reduction. The trick was to make a new simple load model, this one, where the load was a constant power frequency dependent component, and we preserved the network. And then we got a rigorous Lyapunov function. So after all that theory that I had behind me, the answer came about with just a trick of preserving the structure, which begins my story about the role of structure. We got the first rigorous Lyapunov function, and then later it was even shown that this simple first-order equation here can very roughly include the effect of inverter-based renewable power with droop control. So just to emphasize this, the alternatives here, if you have this very simple grid structure and you take the classical route, you assume impedances and collapse the network and you just get two generators connected. If you do the network preserving route, you preserve the network structure, and so you've got a graph and so on, and we'll say more about that later. But this wasn't, at the time, I thought, okay, that's cool, we have a trick which gets a Lyapunov function, but that model is way too simple for stability analysis. So then I got this, we had an interest in Newcastle from Ian Hiskins, who'd been an engineer in industry, and Ian's here today. Sorry, Ian, I found this picture of you all those years ago. And we wanted to treat this stability problem more seriously by including voltage-dependent loads, not constant loads. Then the theory got way more complicated, and we ended up with the Lyapunov theory of differential algebraic systems. The energy functions are multi-valued, there's impasse points, it's way more complicated. But the Lyapunov theory got extended, and hopefully this model was a much better model to analyse stability. But other extensions were done. The Berkeley School, so-called Berkeley School, we concentrated on the loads. The other people at Berkeley, led by Felix and Praveen, did a lot more work on the generator models and network models, making the overall model much more accurate. And there's a book by Xiaodong Qiang which kind of summarises all that work. But there is an unsolved problem here. The rigorous Lyapunov functions for network preserving models where the real power loads have general dependence on voltage, as far as I know, is still not a completely solved problem. I mean, we made good progress with constant power loads and general reactive power, but there's still a homework problem here for anyone who's keen on power system theory. Just briefly, the Lyapunov functions have a separable form in stability theory called Luray-Postnikov, where you have kinetic energy type term and a potential energy type term. With those losses, the fake losses that appear in the classical model, the potential energy term is not integrable. So you have to do a lot of approximations. Now, actually, it was interesting to see a paper yesterday from Alessandro Astolfi's group at Imperial College, where they're still working on this with some progress. But earlier results showed that this separable form won't work, and Romeo Ortega, I think, with Alessandro there too, had made some earlier progress. But this is still an unfinished story all these years later. Okay, my second step here in this control theorist's journey in power systems arises from this event. This was a very bad day in the Swedish power grid in 1983, where the 400 kV network collapsed. And I don't know, a major part of the Swedish grid just blacked out. So I happened to be looking for study leave at about a couple of years later, and was very fortunate to come in contact with this gentleman, Carl Astrom, who we all know. And now Carl, he didn't seem to mind that my background in power was largely theoretical. He just said, hey David, we've got the power industry here, has all these problems. So I went there and spent a study leave. And looking back on it, I'm not sure if I was naive or brave, but the atmosphere in Lund in those days, and probably today, was very much just like, look at the big problems industry has, and not just the routine ones. So that was very encouraging. And so I started talking with two big companies, and we learned that they had lots of stability issues. And I actually used my structure preserving approach on something to do with small disturbance stability for Seacraft. But the big problem was what caused that collapse. and I started talking with an engineer from Vattenfall. He had no mathematics, but he had a very good feeling for what might have gone wrong in terms of it was all the local voltage controllers were supporting their voltage, but that was a bad thing for the overall system. It was propping up the load when the generation was disappearing, which is not a good thing to do. So that discussion led to this idea that he had recordings of where the voltage had dropped, and then the corresponding power at that node had dropped as well and then recovered. So then I figured out that, well, both the transient drop and the steady state drop looked to be voltage dependent. So it was pretty easy, once again, it was pretty easy to come up with a nonlinear differential equation which captured this behavior. But this is not a physically based exercise. This is aggregate behavior of thousands, millions of pieces of equipment. So it was a totally different story to my structure-based activity earlier. So we got this nonlinear differential equation which captured this. Now, the nice thing there was that the engineers at Seedcraft, the leaders at Seedcraft, we wanted to do field tests on this. And they said, okay, well, I could never have done that in Australia. But anyway, coming back, we also got some nice theory. This is the best value book I've ever bought in my life. It's by a Russian master, Vernikov. I bought it for $2 in a Berkeley bookshop. And it had no numerical analysis in it. It was all analytical gems. And in the middle of that was a voltage criterion called the Vernikov criterion. Vernikov's name is associated with two major theoretical pieces of power systems, but I don't have time to say the other one. Anyway, the Vernikov criterion was, in today's terms, a regularity condition for keeping voltage level. And with our new model, we had a transient load characteristic and a steady state load characteristic, which then translated into a transient Jacobian and a steady state Jacobian, and we could state rigorous stability results, voltage stability results around that model. Anyway, that led to, and then Ian Hiskins came back into the picture there, and once again, we're dealing with differential algebraic models, but this time not with the generator dynamics, but with the load dynamics and transformer dynamics. So the general picture building up here for models was the power flow anchors everything, and then you just add the relevant dynamics. Right, but like I said, these load dynamics, this is not physically based. This was aggregate behavior, so inherently data-based in modern terms. So we had models which were part physically based and part data-based. But that led, and I'm still working on this today, I never planned to do this, but just a long series of work now on how we identify the data-based part of the model. It's essentially nonlinear system identification of aggregate models, various techniques, whether you use ambient data versus event data. And then the models keep getting more complicated when you start adding local PV and batteries. And generally speaking, these database techniques have a life of their own these days, going all the way down to households where you're using non-intrusive load modeling to try and figure out what is available for demand response programs and so on. So that's a whole other line of work on database techniques. Right, the third step in this journey was through having an office near this gentleman in Hong Kong. Guanrong Chen is sort of known in the control community, but he's much more known from the point of view of bifurcation analysis, chaos theory, network analysis. And I was listening to his talks, and he had criteria for synchronization of networks that I'd never seen before. Basically, it was an interaction between coupling strengths, network structure, so the lambda 2 here is a graph theory index for connectivity, D is a Lyapunov exponent, and C is a coupling strength for a dynamic network with identical nodes and uniform coupling. But anyway, this got me thinking, why haven't we got criteria like that in power grids? And also this whole area of networks had other interesting ideas in terms of fragility, robustness, and so on. So that led, but there were papers in this area of network science on power grids, but they were just too simplistic. They assumed connectivity models, they assumed really simplistic models. But as I find with a lot of network science stuff, there were sort of interesting ideas, but nothing very precise. It's largely in the hands of physicists, so I'm hoping I'm not offending anyone here. And the thing to realize is that when it comes to a power grid, the graph was, okay, we could see that the graph was being underplayed, and it was more emphasis on node dynamics. But it's that interaction between the nonlinearity and the graph which is kind of unique. And this is one of my favorite little examples from way back in 1972, which was motivated by a practical situation in the Western US where they found different power flow solutions in a kind of ring network. So I see this as an interaction between the nonlinear power flow and that the graph structure, in this case a ring, allowed you to have not only multiple solutions in terms of the nonlinearity, but also in terms of the graph. So this said, this network science stuff is not going to capture that. We need to start again. So this led to a lot of work, which I now call new stability theory, based around networks and graphs. It's a synchronization viewpoint. Graph properties are central. Stability criteria now are in terms of Laplacians, graphs, critical cut sets. And here's a series of papers, and I especially mention Florian Dorfler and Francesco Bullo, who gave the plenary on Tuesday, because they kicked a lot of... Ron and I had a thought piece on it, but that thought piece led me to studying nonlinear networks, but it led maybe those guys to studying power grids, which was really fortunate, and then we followed on afterwards with some more work where in one sense we were making rigorous things that were kind of known loosely in the past, but it also led to some new insights. And I'd just like to briefly mention one of those. Well, I just mentioned in passing that meanwhile physicists went back and started studying the classical network, Cron-reduced network, and which is the one on the right, and our structure-preserving network, and they're writing papers in Nature about this. But the analysis was very simple. But anyway, that old network model that I mentioned kind of got a life of its own in the physics subject. Okay, I just want to quickly mention something totally new that came out of that. And a popular topic these days is microgrids and distributed generation in microgrids, and this is a common picture where you have a connection to the main grid, but also a lot of local generation closer to loads. And some colleagues in Hong Kong, Power Electronics colleagues, were building these microgrids, and they had invented a sort of a smart load device, and they could see that when they started cascading these smart load devices along a feeder, the stability got worse, no matter what they did to the tuning of the controllers. So, but they still thought that this had to be something to do with the controller. And then there was people working for a task force for IEEE, and they came across a similar thing. But we thought, maybe this is something to do with structure of the grid. So, and this is with a smart student, Ye Song, and postdoc. We looked at this algebraic connectivity and noticed that if you could find a node in the network where the connectivity or around that node was vanishing as the number of nodes in the network increased, then this algebraic connectivity would go to zero. Now that's very bad. When the algebraic, this connectivity goes to zero, the Jacobian, an eigenvalue of the Jacobian approaches zero, and then your stability is done. It's purely a structural thing, which was a bit of a surprise, but you know, I love surprises when it comes to theory. So anyway, to illustrate that, the point is the classic distribution structure is exactly a radial network, which means this node connectivity doesn't change. So it perfectly satisfies that criteria. And whatever you do in terms of tuning the controllers, the structure of that system kills you if you start adding too many things along the feeder. Problem is that's a classic structure for distribution. And other people now are following up on this with more detailed models. Now, I'm just going to mention very briefly a few other things that we got involved in, which kind of relate to this structure versus data issue. We got a big project with the Australian government to look at the dynamics of the grid in terms of all these concepts of small disturbance stability, large disturbance, etc., out to 2050. Well, that's a big ask because we don't even know what the grid will look like that far out. So we had to do scenario-based analysis. But the sort of things we were looking for in that study was, well, how far can we go with renewable integration before problems happen? And this is a question that never really gets put in the public. I heard recently that one of the biggest dangers of the energy transition in Australia is excessive optimism. And this kind of limit that emerges here, which I can only indicate, says around 60–70% really you need to start doing something different. We can go all that way with different scenarios of existing ideas. But after that, we need new concepts, and that means new control, which is where you come in, right? If we're going to go above, according to this study, if we're going to go above 60%, we need more systems and control ideas. Okay, now I'm really going to skip over the next two things because I arrive here at CDC, I see that there's deep learning, machine learning all over the place, and so I'm certainly not the only person doing that. But we've been doing studies on stability analysis where you think of the grid as like a movie with all this data coming off it. And the usual approach is to take data kind of node by node, but if you take all the data and process it like a series of images, maybe we can get some new ideas with stability, and then we won't get so hung up on the details of mathematical modeling. So it's part of the story of data-based versus structure. And then we try and close the loop on those techniques. So this is basically a paper which implemented a version of data-based model predictive control, but I now see many people around here have been doing that kind of thing, so I won't dwell on it. Okay, so the few minutes left, I want to talk about future grids. And seriously, in many countries, but in Australia in particular, that's where we're headed. And in Australia, it's a special problem because we're an island. Well, except for the fact that that young tech entrepreneur, Cannon Brooks, he wants to, he's plans to build the largest solar farm in the world in the Northern Territory and sell power to Singapore. I'm not sure you know about that, Li Hua, but they want to run a cable to Singapore and sell power to you, with the world's largest battery, of course. Anyway, I mentioned these two transitions, decarbonisation of the major grid, and out of that we expect to see coal-fired plants replaced by energy hubs. These energy hubs will consist of a large renewable farm and a big battery, and can make use of the existing grid infrastructure. That's the idea. And this young guy, Sol Griffith, is an Aussie, actually from Newcastle in Australia, and he's been living in the US for some years, and I think he even got to advise the government, and he's really pushing electrification as the solution to climate change. And so electrification with renewables and hydrogen. I'm not sure he even likes hydrogen. Anyway, but this brings new control problems, and these two graphs are quite common to illustrate those. The top graph shows South Australian wind versus South Australian load, and they're not exactly in synchronism here. So how do we bridge that gap? And well, solar helps, and of course batteries help, and then there's demand management. And the other graph, this is an Australian version of the so-called duck curve, which shows the impact of solar in the middle of the day, where it gets to a point where there's negative load on the grid, and we actually have to consider there's terms now like solar soaking, you know, all this excess solar that's coming off rooftops, what do we do with it? And, you know, solar pre-cooling, there's a lot of control-related ideas to kind of fill in this, this middle area here in the load curve. So what might the future grid look like? Well, I took this picture out of another paper, not my own, where we have inverter-based resources everywhere. Basically, the future grid becomes, there's a remnant of the classical grid down here with turbine generators, and in Australia that will be largely based around some gas units until they disappear, but hydro. We have some substantial hydro resources, but the rest of it is going to be batteries, PV, wind farms, on the grid side, and then on the household side, there's distributed generation, constant power loads, and microgrids. And in the middle, a lot more power electronic control. And the dynamics here now are not just electromechanical, they're actually electromagnetic. In the past, we were able to ignore basically the electromagnetic dynamics and concentrate on electromechanical. Now, the electromechanical is headed to become the minor part, and the major part is electromagnetic, which even brings into question, can we still use phasor-based methods, okay? The power flow equations are really now replaced by wave equations flying, you know, on the grid. Okay, so a few years ago, I was asked by the power and energy community to give in a plenary session, to give my take on what were big scientific questions for future grids. And for some reason I came up with 8. I was living in Hong Kong. 8's a lucky number in China, I'm not sure. But I just came up with these 8. So, of course, I could probably write a slightly different list these days, but I just thought I'd mention these now because they're largely control problems. The new faster stability of high converter systems, I'll say a bit more about soon, but that's like starting all over again with the stability problem of electrical grids. You know, can we get Lyapunov functions? Can we get, what kind of analysis will we use? And then there's a big question around the structure of control and markets. The existing market in Australia is absolutely had its day, and we need to replace it by something else. Control structures interact with markets. In a way, markets replaced some of the traditional control in power grids. Like they turned off primary frequency control in Australia at some point, which I was shocked to learn. They don't have bias control on tie line exchange. They just figure the market can implement that. So this, what I think of as a really interesting control problem, when you hand it over to economists, they see a lot of markets, which I think is an issue for the control community. In a sense, we're being pushed aside by economists. But anyway, so the granular situation here, once again, is households to big grids, kilowatts to gigawatts. What are the new, it's now one big system. So what are the new markets and what are the new control structures? And think, you know terms like ISO, regional transmission operator, system operator, now distributed system operator. There's all these financial and control entities that need to be worked out to make the new system with renewable power work. And that needs control engineers to be standing there with the economists. Otherwise we'll get maybe a result that's not ideal. Now, I mentioned my project with the Australian government to analyse stability out to 2050. The students who were working with me on that, they would initiate a study. They'd come back, or had to come back a week later until the results were there. So there's obviously scope for a big computer science type project, computing type project, to analyse into the future here. So I just mentioned that. If the government in Australia will give me $20 million, I reckon I can make a start on that project. But at the moment, it's undercooked. Data-based adaptive control seems to be happening, and also in the power area. I mentioned better structures because the focus in power systems, when you speak to people practically, they're very focused on their own network. They don't really think in terms of what's a better network. So, but I think that science, that network science approach that I mentioned, should be brought into planning processes more. And there was some work in Madison, Wisconsin. Chris DeMarco, who's another Berkeley PhD from that era, led some work there, but he's retired now, so we need someone else to pick that up. And that's just how network connectivity plays into planning a grid. Now, grid flexibility, I'm working on this now a lot. In the past, we had a generation dispatch. Now the generation is variable, so we can do some things, but we can't completely dispatch it. Now we think in terms of we can't dispatch anything precisely, but we can control something on the generation side, and we can control something on the load side. So there's a lot of activity in demand management, how electric vehicles can play into supporting the grid. But the missing story there is how the grid can be more flexible. And if you try and make a grid big enough to absorb all the fluctuations of variable power flows, I think it's going to be way too expensive. So how to make the grid flexible so that you can get corridors of power through the grid from where the renewables are big right now to the loads is I think, an interesting development. Back then, when I made this list, the energy trilemma was a thing. And this is at the level of carbon trading and energy markets, how you get clean, reliable, affordable energy. But I think the way things have developed in Australia now, it's become a dilemma, not a trilemma, because emissions are being dealt with already by replacing coal-fired plants by renewable power. Another hot topic is resilience. Power grids are not designed, they're designed to be robust. In particular, you should be able to lose any major piece of equipment and it will still work. But this whole transition in Australia is helped by the fact that we seem to be having once in 100-year events every year now. I think in the last 3 years we've had 1 year of some of the worst bushfires in history and 2 years of some of the worst floods. And now they're talking about a new round of bushfires. And all this, it makes it easier to get people to think that climate change is a problem and hence we should do something to mitigate it. So the renewable power is happening at a great speed, but we're still left with how to make the grid affordable and reliable, okay? So that's the resilience question. Now, to say a little, before I finish up, I'll just say a little bit about that stability issue. This was, in the green box here, was the diagram I showed you before with the different stability taxonomy around frequency, voltage, and rotor angles. There was a recent revision of that in a task force that Ian and I were part of, and they simply tacked on these 2 extra boxes. And one of the boxes is called converter-driven stability. But in my humble opinion, this is very much an interim story because this has to be, we know what's inside these boxes. We know what the mechanism is, we know what the analytical techniques are. But this box needs development. The the whole new converter-fed stability story, how different types of inverters, you might hear grid-forming, grid-following type inverters, how they interact with each other on a grid. Well, that's a story that needs to be developed, and we have very little theory about it. So it's kind of like where I was as a postdoc, we're kind of back there again with these new problems. This is just to illustrate these new problems. This came out of an ESIG talk recently. It's an oscillation that just appeared in the Scottish grid, and as far as I know, they still can't explain it, but there's been very similar oscillations appearing recently in Australia, in Victoria actually, where I now live, and northern China. And just like what happened with inertia-based oscillations many years ago, there are local versions and system-wide versions. The local versions seem to be able to be fixed by controller retuning, and in China, I don't have a precise story, but I believe they used a kind of a data-based ad hoc approach that killed the oscillation, which is interesting because that might be how we have to deal with it if the dynamics are too complicated to capture in models. But it's the system-wide versions that are kind of frightening because we really don't understand those too well. I mean, I'm saying from my point of view, there could well be people in the room who are onto this already. I imagine at ETH you're working on it, and I know Ian has been working on some, and I know Romeo Ortega here in Mexico has been doing some theory around phase lock loops in grid-following inverters. But this is the call to arms. This is exciting new dynamics problems and control problems arising from the energy transition. I've already mentioned the control replacing markets issue, so I think I'll skip over that. The conclusions are that, well, I hope you see that power systems is a subject where there's theoretical problems, practical problems, but it's not a place where you can just come with an existing tool and expect to apply it immediately. Everything I've ever done has involved revisiting the model first, and sometimes the tool you had in mind is not what is needed. Something else is needed. So I like to think of systems and control as a way of thinking, not as like I've got a couple of tools and I'm going to go and apply them everywhere. I think for the future, I mentioned the two transitions. People are actually thinking in terms of unknown unknowns, in terms of the dynamics that might arise. The end-to-end power system is embedded in the weather system, which I just mentioned, which may even be an interesting project, that kind of feedback loop there. We need a lot more modeling, dynamics, and distributed control, and there's a larger energy community involved, which can be good, like scientists, economists, even lawyers in Australia. But it can also lead to problems because we don't all have a common language. So I would love to see now something like Systems Engineering for Power Mark II, and I'll stop there except to say a couple of thank yous. I want to say, besides the people I thanked earlier, I want to thank Brian Anderson sitting down there in the front, because he's the guy who got me into systems and control. Thank you, Brian. And set a very high standard in Australia. I have many colleagues in the power community, which I won't mention because they're not here. And I want to thank all my students and postdocs. And this is a memorable picture from my last lunch in Hong Kong with the group that I had there. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David. That has been a fantastic talk, and I would like now to invite Li Hua in order to invite for the next CDC. And I hope you know how to do this thing.
Okay, thank you, Thomas, and good morning to all. I also like to take this opportunity to thank Elena and Angus for giving me this opportunity to introduce CDC 2023. And as you know that the CDC 2023 will be held in Singapore over the past couple of days, I'm glad to know that many feel excited about the CDC in Singapore. And this, together with the great success of this CDC here, give me the confidence to make the next events successful. And me and my team will work hard to put together exciting program and also social events to make your trip rewarding. Now, the CDC will be held in this hotel called Marina Bay Sands, which is the iconic hotel in Singapore. And it's not just a hotel, but it is an integrated resource where you have convention center, you have a shopping mall, you have many dining places, and even you can ride a boat, or even if you like, you can play some casinos and so on. And behind the hotel, we have very famous garden by the bay, where you have a very big flower dome, which shows many plants all over the world. And also you have water park for your children, and also many activities around there. In front, you have a lake, you have Opera House of Singapore, and Asia Civilization Museum, and also you can take a cruise along the Singapore rivers. And over the river, in both banks of the river here, you have many restaurants of various varieties. And as you know, Singapore, of course, is famous for its safe, green, and also multicultural society. And we have Malay, Indian, Chinese, and of course, Westerns. It is real cultural melting pot, and where you can see many multicultural heritage together with many different kind of cuisines. And of course, Singapore is a tropical weather, and in December, the weather is just like Cancun here, maybe a little bit humid here really it's a tropical, and you can enjoy the sun shining, and in December, especially for people from Europe. And of course, Singapore, we have a modern transportation system, which is very convenient for you to make your trip to all over Singapore. It's, for example, if you want to go Botanic Garden, you just take about 4 or 5 metros from the Marina Bay Sands, and to go to the famous Ocelot shopping centers, take you about 4 metro stations to go to the shopping paradise over there. Okay, I think I would just like to play a video to show you what Singapore can offer.
For more than 50 years, Singapore has not only existed, we've thrived. But beneath our glossy exterior and bright lights, something else burns brightly. Our passion. It's made us a nation of vision and imagination. A city with endless possibilities.
The Singapore story is one of turning possibilities into reality. This is a place where ideas, passions, technology, capital, and people meet to spark new collaborations and ventures. That is why Singapore is well placed to help you grow your business, to discover new opportunities, and to network with the smartest and most innovative people in your fields.
In addition to hosting global business events, we've also been the stage for the IMF World Bank meetings, Sibos, the inaugural Youth Olympic Games, and the world's only Formula One night street race. We are proud to give each event a unique Singaporean flavor. Our strong and developed key sectors will allow you to tap opportunities, insights, and form partnerships. Singapore is located in the heart of Southeast Asia, with access to 4 billion people within a 7-hour flight radius. Your delegates will arrive at Changi Airport, consistently voted one of the world's best airports, with a seamless immigration system and smooth access to the city. Delegates can choose from a wide selection of hotels, from luxury to more intimate boutique options. Our efficient and affordable public transport system makes getting around a breeze, so you can easily enjoy what our city has to offer.
To complement your business agenda, Singapore offers vibrant and diverse leisure options with our colorful multicultural heritage, world-class entertainment, and a wide range of dining offerings from the world's best fine dining restaurants to our renowned street food and hawker centers. We believe this seamless integration of work and play makes Singapore a compelling destination for your event, one with endless possibilities to learn, grow, connect, and have fun. We look forward to welcoming you to Singapore, a country where passions are made possible.
With that, I welcome all of you and look forward to seeing you all in Singapore next year. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So yes, please, since we have a little bit of delay, we have to partition the ballroom in breakout rooms. I would kindly ask you to go out to the coffee break. Thank you.